Good afternoon. On behalf of the Wilson Center, the Latin American program, and its Brazil Institute, you're welcome to the National Memorial of the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Today, we are here to talk about a book recently published by Larry Rotter, a dear friend of mine, a journalist, former correspondent of the New York Times to Caribbean countries, to Latin America, and to Brazil. Larry has worked for a total of has lived for a total of 14 years in Brazil. Not only that, he started his career as a journalist, working for Globo Television as a researcher, as a faz tudo.
Yeah, researcher,
producer, translator, pau para toda obra kind of person in New York. And even better, he's married to a Brazilian. And even better, his wife is a direct descendant from Barão do Rio Branco. It's a Paranhos. So the guy is completely authentic Brazil. Larry is a great friend, really has lived in Brazil, has reported on Brazil, and loves Brazil. We all know his friends. We are joined here today by a dear friend, Peter Hakim. This is a joint event co-sponsored by the Inter-American Dialogue and the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center. We are very pleased to be able to collaborate on this. I would just ask Peter if you want to say a couple words, and then I will invite Larry to present the book. We all hope that you buy 2 copies, and Christmas is upon us, so it's a great gift. Peter.
Let me just say it's always a great pleasure to be here with you, Paolo, at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and then do what I rarely do, give up the opportunity to say anything more now and wait till my turn. So I'll turn it over to Larry.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here. I don't get to Washington as much as I would like, and you know, I went to school here, School of Foreign Service, and always been nostalgic about coming back. And I'm particularly pleased to be here in these circumstances. So the book is called Brazil on the Rise. And let me make clear from the beginning, it's not a scholarly book, or really an academic book. It's a book that really is my interpretation, my analysis of the country in the almost 40 years that I've been dealing with it. But I do want to start by doing something that is maybe a little bit academic. I say Brazil on the rise, but on the rise from what? So let me establish a baseline. Obviously, I could pick just about any baseline I wanted, but my starting point is really 1972, which is the year I first went to Brazil. And as Paulo has pointed out, I was at that time a employee of Rede Globo de Televisão in the New York bureau. And I was sent to work on what was, well, it was called the International Song Festival, which you remember, right? Mm-hmm. Brazilians of, you know, of a certain age, I guess I should say, all remember those shows. So here I am, a graduate student at that point at Columbia, arriving in Brazil. Oh, and I wasn't a Latin Americanist either. I was studying modern Chinese history and politics, but I kind of got diverted, which explains my presence here today. But so let me talk about that Brazil that I encountered when I first went there, starting with the politics of it. The country was at that time ruled by a military dictatorship. The existing political parties had been banned and all political activity was channeled into two really artificial constructs, one supporting the dictatorship, one against it. This is a very Brazilian solution. It wasn't like what later would happen in Chile or Argentina. We can talk about that later in another context. Leading political figures, however, had their political rights taken away, including what was then the person who was then, in my estimation, the most popular politician in the country, the former president Juscelino Kubitschek. It was a completely kind of abnormal political situation. There was censorship of the press. Some news organizations fought against it, most notably the newspaper that employed Paulo for many years, O Estado de São Paulo. I can remember going to the first mid-afternoon story meeting in Rio that TV Globo was having, and there was a military officer in the room, and the editors, and I was sitting, it was a room much like this, around a table, and I was just an anonymous face in the room. I don't think he guessed that I was a foreigner. I just kept my trap shut. And he would sign off or no on the stories that were being suggested. What's that one about? No. Well, that one, yes, maybe, but you can't say this. It was a real eye-opener for someone whose knowledge as a graduate student was theoretical. I can remember going to a party in Ipanema of people my age, grad school age, and there was a song that people wanted to play. It had been banned. You already know what I'm going to say, right? Mm-hmm. But it was played at this party, but at really low volume because people were afraid that the neighbors might hear and call the police. It was a song called Pra Não Dizer Que Não Falei das Flores. So as not to say I didn't speak of the flowers. And it was the anthem of resistance to the military dictatorship. And the author, because of that, was forced into exile. But the song was everywhere. And even now, it's funny, I think every Brazilian over 50 who's in public life, if you ask, they can sing the lyrics to that song. Mm-hmm. I've never met anybody who can't. So there was this atmosphere of oppression. It's not the kind of oppression that I would hear stories about when I was a correspondent in China from people who lived through the Cultural Revolution, but by Brazilian standards, it was a quite unpleasant time. General Medici was in charge. I remember going to Santos Dumont Airport on my first trip to São Paulo, and the airport, all the columns had posters, wanted posters of terroristas. All of them kind of studious-looking young people with long hair and glasses, people who looked a lot like me. And some of them, actually, it'd be interesting to know if Dilma was ever on, Dilma Rousseff, who's likely to become president, and we'll get to that too, if she was ever on any of those wanted posters. I have to look into that. But that was the political atmosphere that prevailed. Economically, where was Brazil? Well, the economy was still largely based on agriculture. Coffee was still the dominant crop. The weather bulletins from Minas Gerais and São Paulo, was there a frost? Is it going to affect the harvest, which would affect the price? That was always big news. São Paulo was already industrialized, but the huge industrial base that we know today, it wasn't at that level. Embraer, the aircraft company, had been founded 3 years before, but there was a lot that is important today that wasn't there. This is 1972. It's 2 years before Embrapa, the agricultural research company, was set up by the government. It's 3 years before the Proálcool, the ethanol program, was founded. So Brazil at that point was still a producer and exporter of raw materials, predominantly. And the other side of the coin was, of course, the way that income was distributed. There were gross inequalities, terrible inequalities, as has historically been the case. There was a small and very prosperous elite at the top of a pyramid and a huge mass at the bottom. And there was definitely a skin color correlation. The people at the bottom were definitely darker, and the people at the top had definitely lighter skin. And you know, staying in a hotel in Copacabana, walking along the beach, you would see families that had spent the night on the sidewalk begging. You'd see police that would come and run them off so that the tourists wouldn't see this terrible sight of poverty right in front of their eyes. The infrastructure was deficient. I remember landing at Galeão Airport, and it was the old Galeão, not the gleaming, shining one that exists today. And it was like, frankly, it was like an airport out of Woody Allen's Bananas. It was all very manual and hot and no air conditioning and slow and guys in strange uniforms. And it didn't boast much about what kind of infrastructure Brazil might have. All right, so that's a baseline. Let's jump ahead to where we are today, and I'll talk about that and then talk about the process, how we got from point A to point B. As regards the economy, I'll talk about politics, but I'm going to reverse the order here. Brazil's economy is today the 8th largest in the world. The Economist Intelligence Unit just put something out predicting that next year Brazil will pass Italy to become number 7. Brazil has its foreign reserves are now, gosh, I think the last figure I saw was $260-something billion. $165 billion of which is parked in U.S. securities, Treasury securities, which makes Brazil the 4th largest creditor of the United States. We all know about China and the $2 trillion that they've got, $2 trillion plus. Japan comes next, I believe, and then the UK. Brazil is now in 4th place. This is a country that at the time that I first went to Brazil, and even as recently as 1998, early 1999, when I returned to be the Times correspondent, was in debt to chronically with problems that required IMF packages. The last one, which was late 98, early 99, $42.5 billion. Today, Brazil is a net donor to the IMF. Exports have boomed, and I think Brazil remains the world's largest exporter of coffee, but coffee is now, instead of number 1 on the list, it's number 9, I think the last time I looked. Soybeans have pushed past it. Beef, orange juice, poultry, cocoa, all of that. And there's been a huge increase in production of all kinds of foodstuffs and agricultural products. At some point, I'm going to go over to the map and talk about how that took place and where it took place. I remember when Colin Powell came to Brazil in 2005, he talked about Brazil as an agricultural superpower. And he was stating the obvious. I'm from the Midwest, I'm from Illinois, and I have cousins who are soybean and corn farmers. And believe you me, they are very much aware of Brazil. as are farmers in Iowa, throughout the Midwest. But that's not the only part of the story. If we look at that list of export items, there have been some years in the past decade where the number one export item has been airplanes, aircraft, followed by automobiles and auto parts. That's not the case right now, but Embraer, the company I mentioned that was founded in 1969 in the state of São Paulo, in São José dos Campos, is the third largest manufacturer of aircraft in the world. And it's employed a strategy that other Brazilian companies have used with great astuteness and ability, which is you can't compete with everybody and everything. Find yourself a niche. They couldn't compete with Boeing or Airbus on the big carriers, so they focused on the intermediate jets, the commuter jets, so that if you fly from, I don't know, let's say Washington to Cincinnati, the odds are you're flying on an Embraer jet. In 2008, I worked on the New York Times coverage of the presidential campaign here in the US. I spent some time on the road with Sarah Palin, and she traveled in an Embraer jet, the largest one that Embraer makes. You know, as they say in Brazil, quem diria? You know, who would have thunk it all those
Has
years
not
ago?
revealed that publicly too until now. So now you know. Sarah Palin traveled in the Brazilian-made aircraft.
So the economy really has been transformed. What was strong before has been a base to build on. There's been plenty of innovation. And towards the end of my talk, I'm going to kind of sound the cautionary note. I don't want to sound too boosterish here. There are pitfalls down the road, and I will talk about those. But at this phase of my presentation, I want to talk about what's been achieved, and it's been remarkable in the economic realm. The political side has been dramatic as well. In 1985, the military dictatorship stepped down. There was popular demand to do so, but there was also an orchestrated campaign that had begun in the late 1970s to guide the country towards a return to democracy. The first few years of the democratic transition were very, very messy, chaotic even, starting from the very beginning. Tancredo Neves, who everybody had agreed upon would become the first civilian president after the end of the dictatorship, became ill and died before he could take office. His vice president took office instead, José Sarney, who was a member of the northeastern oligarchy from the state of Maranhão, which, well, I'm not going to walk over there, but it's up there in the northeast, and had been a supporter of the military dictatorship. He had been in that artificial party that the military had created for its supporters. He became president instead. And José Sarney is a great politician. He's a terrific horse trader. And even today, he's an important factor in Brazilian politics. Right, that's right. He's from Maranhão, but it represents a different state. It's one of those things like Hillary Clinton being from Illinois like me, but she was senator from New York. He is from the state of Amapá, which is way, way up there next to French Guiana, even though he's from Maranhão. So he was president instead of Tancredo Neves. And he didn't know, he was a great horse trader, as I said, but he didn't know much about economics, and it got very, very messy, lots of inflation. There was an election in '89. Lula, the current president, ran for the first time against Fernando Collor de Mello, another member of the northeastern oligarchy. Collor de Mello won. There was a corruption scandal. He stepped down as he was about to be impeached. He was replaced by his vice president, who was a rather folkloric character from the state north of Rio. And then came the election where I think things started to change, and the Brazil that we see today started taking shape. Fernando Henrique Cardoso was elected president, served 2 terms, was succeeded by Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who's now finishing out his 2 terms. And Brazil today is a vibrant, noisy, tumultuous, but flourishing democracy. You've got multiple parties. The last count I did was 21. Not all of them represented in Congress, but many of them with some representation. You have a press that's also quite aggressive, to the chagrin of those in power. Even as we speak, there's a scandal that's been broken, and we'll get to that could have some impact on the presidential campaign. You have a judiciary that doesn't hesitate to challenge the power of the executive. It's day and night compared to what was there in 1972. And I might as well get this out of the way, because somebody will probably bring it up in the question period if I don't address it now, which is that in 2004 I had a run-in with the president, a story that I wrote that peeved him, and there was an order issued for my expulsion from the country. I think that in the old days, during the military dictatorship, I probably would have had to leave. But in a democratic Brazil, what happened was the Brazilian press made a real stink, pointing out, for example, that I was being prosecuted under the same law that the president himself had been at one point arrested and held during the military dictatorship. And the judiciary, well, Brazilian law allows third parties to step in and ask for injunctions. And a senator, whose father was a journalist, but who I didn't know personally, asked for a writ, an injunction to prevent me from being kicked out. And the Supreme Court quickly ruled that as a foreigner, I had the same rights as a Brazilian, and I could not be expelled. The president, to his credit, accepted that verdict, didn't try to challenge it, didn't try to run me out of the country. And so the lesson that I took away from that experience, and which I'm constantly saying to Brazilians who want to find out, are you bitter about it? Did it color your perceptions of the country? The answer is, look, this is the way institutions are supposed to function in a democracy. The president had what I always call an authoritarian spasm. He was checked by the institutions that are in place, and he accepted the limits of power. There's a lot of Latin American countries even today where that would not be the case, and all we got to do is look at the map at some of Brazil's neighbors, and we know that. So now let me talk about how we got from point A to point B. The landmarks along the way. Number one is one I've already mentioned, which is the end of the military dictatorship, the return of civilian democratic rule in March of 1985. It was very, very chaotic and messy for those first 9 years. But again, there are things I would point to as positive. The impeachment process against Fernando Collor de Mello, again, democratic institutions prevailed. There was not any kind of an intervention by the military. Things worked the way they were supposed to work. The last 16 years since the election of Fernando Henrique Cardoso in October of 1994, really was a watershed, I think, in both the political sense and the economic sense. Politically, you have the election of a man with really impeccable democratic instincts. He had been in exile himself. He was an intellectual, very much interested as a sociologist in the issue of racial and economic inequality, and determined to do something about it. And a believer in the free press, even when it was nipping at his heels. You got to give him credit for not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. And so that's the start, really, of a 16-year cycle of political stability and economic stability that probably is unrivaled in the history of modern Brazil. To Cardoso's credit also, and actually Paulo and I were at an event in Miami a couple days ago, and I said something then about how the economic consolidation, the war against inflation that had always been the Achilles heel of the Brazilian economy really was engaged and essentially won with the creation of a new currency and an economic stabilization plan. Even before Fernando Henrique Cardoso was president, Itamar Franco was president at the time, the kind of folkloric guy that I mentioned, but he had the wisdom to put the sociologist in as Minister of Finance, and that sociologist had the wisdom to get people who were capable, good, solid economists to attack the dragon of inflation. And inflation was, in fact, stopped dead in its tracks in a very short time. This was really historic. When I used to go to Brazil on vacation in the early 90s, there were months I can recall when people, the inflation rate was 75, 80% for some really bad months. And people got into the habit of spending their wages as soon as they got them, knowing that they would erode almost from the instant you cashed your check. Buying beans and rice if you were, in the lower class or the lower middle class. When inflation was vanquished, really for the first time, people who were wage earners and had to live on their salaries could become consumers. They were able to buy television sets, refrigerators, fans, all of what Brazilians call eletrodomésticos, things that run on electricity. And they were able to do so on time, even. Imagine buying, you used to have to pay cash down for everything. Now you could, spread it out, and people did that. And this was an enormous boost to domestic consumption and domestic production, because you're bringing in millions and millions of people who were formerly outside the money economy, and they become consumers and, to a greater degree, citizens. They no longer also have to send their children to work to make more money. So you had kids staying on in high school. The number of high school graduates shot up during the time that Fernando Henrique was president. The government invested money in clinics, in housing, in education. So it wasn't just the kind of notion of let's get the macro picture looking better. There was interest also in the micro side. Now, Brazilian presidents can only serve 2 terms, so Fernando Henrique Cardoso had to step down. Lula, running for the 4th time, abandoned his notion of a rupture with the world capitalist order, talked a more moderate policy, and was elected in the fall of 2002, took office January 1st, 2003, and with the Wall Street and the international financial community wondering, what is he going to do? There was a run on the real, but Lula, to his great credit, didn't go for any kind of economic adventurism. Instead, he largely has followed the broad outlines of the policies that were established in the Cardoso years. He has deepened and expanded many of the social programs with the money that's been accumulating over this this period. I have a friend in São Paulo who's a founder of the PT, the Workers' Party. His name is Chico de Oliveira, who Paulo probably knows. And he always used to complain. I remember during the first year that Lula was in power, his complaint was, well, we're really in the 9th year of the Fernando Henrique Cardoso government. And then the second year, well, we're really in the 10th year of the Fernando Henrique Cardoso government. Well, I think by CHICO's standards, we're now maybe in the 16th year of the Fernando Henrique government. I'm exaggerating a bit, but one of the great things that Lula has done is to kind of frustrate the expectations of what are known in Brazilian politics as the Shiites, the people on the far left of the Workers' Party. So it's been a 16-year cycle, but there's an election in 3 weeks. And the country, for the first time since the end of military rule, is going to have an election in which neither Fernando Henrique Cardoso nor Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is a presidential candidate. And that creates a whole new political scenario with new players, new actors, and some very important choices for the country to make. Let me talk then a bit about the election and the candidates and what they stand for, and then I can speculate a bit about what might happen and what that would mean. There's 3 candidates at this juncture. There were originally 4, but Lula was maneuvered very adroitly and removed one candidate who would have siphoned off votes from his anointed successor. She is Dilma Rousseff, who in 2002 came into the government as the Minister of Energy. She had previously been a state secretary of energy in Rio Grande do Sul, the southernmost state in Brazil, bordering Uruguay. She's an economist. She was a member of the revolutionary armed left during the years of the dictatorship. She joined the Workers' Party in 2001, so she's a latecomer to the party. And when in 2005 Lula's government was struck by a very severe corruption scandal that involved vote buying, and Lula's chief of staff, José Dirceu, had to step down because he was implicated in what was going on. Dilma Rousseff. Brazilians talk about their politicians by the first name. You know, Lula, Dilma, Getúlio, Juscelino. So I've kind of fallen into that habit. I hope nobody takes offense. So Dilma Rousseff was brought into the presidential palace to be Lula's chief of staff, and she has proved to be a very capable administrator. She's, it's one of those cliches, the Iron Lady. I mean, I think it inevitably gets attached to a female politician who has, who can be tough, and she has, and so that cliche has been put on her. But she's more than that. She's really she's brought order and discipline into the presidential palace, and the country has run better for that reason, especially since Lula is a president who doesn't really like detail work. And so she gets to do a lot of the scut work, and obviously that's good preparation for someone running for president. Now, she, however, has never run for public office before. She's starting at the very top. She's not a great orator. She's stiff, wooden, all those adjectives. Her personality seems somewhat authoritarian. And in a different political scenario, she might lose out to a more charismatic candidate. She has the good fortune of, however, of running against a candidate whose personality is very much like hers, a technocrat. José Serra, also an economist. Lula defeated him in 2002. He's now the governor of São Paulo, a terrific political base, the country's largest state. You have to step down when you run. Yeah. But he's been the governor, mayor of São Paulo, and governor of the state. So you've got these two kind of definitely uncharismatic candidates running against each other. Dilma's great advantage is that Lula appears to have been able to transfer his enormous popularity to her. She is his anointed. It's almost like a dedazo in Mexico. I mean, it doesn't function the same way, but he has anointed her in that same way. And for all the deficiencies I pointed out, the polls indicate that she's on the cusp of being able to win in a first-round vote. You have to win 50% plus one to avoid a runoff. She's within the margin of error. I'm not going to be crazy enough to make a prediction as to what's going to happen, but she's in a favorable position. So the odds are that she's going to be the next president of Brazil, and I guess we can talk about that. Should I do that now?
No, I think because I think we would normally engage in the Q&A
Okay.
on that, so I would just ask Peter to comment, his comments on the book. I will say something later, and then we open up.
Sure.
Well, Larry, it's a great honor to be commenting on your book.
Thank you.
You've obviously spent a lot more time in Brazil than I did, although
Lucky me.
I got there 5 years before you did. So,
Lucky you.
and let me just say that this is a book I read from cover to cover, and I can't say I've commented on lots of books that I haven't read from cover to cover.
I've noticed that.
And since I did read it cover to cover, I'm going to comment on it, damn it, not on what you said. And let me first say that there's no question this is a very good book. Covered a lot of ground. It covered it very well. Some of the chapters were really outstanding, even for somebody like me who follows Brazil reasonably closely. It was terribly informative. The chapter on the Amazon, the chapter on energy, these were really sort of contained a lot of very good, nicely woven together information. I do have, Larry, as you imagine, this is a but clause
okay.
now. Have some questions and a few pieces of critical commentary. Let me just say that someone, I wish I remembered who it was, probably someone here will remember, in the early part of the last century once said that the best introduction to U.S. culture and society was to read the Sears catalog, a huge department store that put out a huge, they didn't have the internet then, you probably remember.
We know it wasn't de Tocqueville.
Right. And at times I felt that I was reading a catalog rather than a sort of interconnected argument. And it left me unsure of what the connecting tissue was between the various parts. And and also left me wondering at times, Larry, what was left out. For example, I noted there's only 2 pages on Getulio Vargas, who probably was the person who most influenced the thinking of
The shaping of modern Brazil.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. There was something like 5 pages throughout the book on the 24 years of military rule. And yet there was a whole chapter on the jeitinho, how Brazilians conduct their business. And I thought that it was just unclear to me why one department got so much more. I also thought at times, and this may get me in trouble, that you tended to avoid some complexities. And let me give you a couple of examples. Now, in the chapter on the environment, you said that Lula was faced with a choice between the environment or development, and he chose development. And this was clearly, in the context of the book, a criticism that he should have chosen the environment. And in fact, this is never a choice for anybody to choose between the two. There's no country in the world, maybe a few Scandinavian countries, I'm sorry, that can choose the environment and not worry about development and job growth and economic. So in other words, he had to find a way to balance those two. And sort of you lost that. There was some on the discussion of the race, which I thought was very well done. On the other hand, you at points try to suggest there was either societies were racist or colorblind. And in most situations, it's a very much more complex that some people are more or less, but it enters in different ways and different, anyway, I think there was at times this sort of trying to get through a very important topic or theme, and you sort of lost some complexity. And Brazil is a tremendously complex country. Finally, the two questions I have that went somewhat unanswered, and this is why this is encouragement now to write another book.
All right. I don't need much encouragement.
Well, whether you need it or not, you're going to get it.
Okay.
One is, and this is a question, by the way, that I hear a lot in Brazil and a lot here, is how long is Brazil's rise going to last? Indeed, if one had to talk about the rise, you can go back in history, talk from 72, you can talk about it from the beginning of the Cardoso administration. But in fact, it wasn't until about 2005 that the Brazilian economy was beginning to perform. And it was only really the Brazilian emergence from the global financial crisis in such good shape, without being really scathed in any way, that really sort of set Brazil up as sort of, what I call now the second best brand in the world, right after Apple and just before Nike. And it reminds me, it's an important question. How long is this going to last? It reminds me, I had a daughter, she was 13, and she was doing terribly in school, or she had been doing terribly, and she switched schools, and all of a sudden she began to get A's and good grades, and one day I was walking her to school, and she turns to me, she says, "Peter, I don't understand this. I'm not doing anything differently, and all of a sudden I'm getting all good grades." She says, "How long is this going to last?" And the fact is, I think that Brazilians, and Paulo can tell me, your wife could tell you, are worrying about how long is this going to last. I don't expect an answer to that, but what are some of the guiding questions?
Sure.
Secondly, Paulo, and this is the second thing you should put in the book, how will Brazil use its newfound stature, power, influence in the global? Will it be, what are the alternatives at least? What are the choices that Brazil, is Brazil going to be a champion of non-proliferation in the years to come? Or is it going to be a country that begins to sort of develop the capacity and keeps taking one step after another until, is Brazil going to be a champion for integration in South America and Latin America, or is it really going to be content with a group of countries that are basically good neighbors and not really try to build? The issue, what does it really want out of international institutions? Is Brazil constructive or not constructive? And that's a really hard set of questions. The
But
Iran
I like
thing
them.
is only the beginning.
I agree.
And like I say, I think it's a great book, but I think the story has to be completed. If it's the rise, how long does it keep rising, or how long does it stay on top, and what does it do up there?
I like
Thank
those
you.
questions. I'm happy to answer them. But
Can I
Yeah.
add some comments? And I actually, I like the book very much, and you'll be surprised. The chapter I like most is chapter 5 about Brazilian culture. Not only because he is now working at the New York Times Cultural Session, so his current job. I think it is the longest chapter, I think. Isn't it?
It may be.
Yeah. And it is, I enjoyed it very much because it shows something for a country that I think is not rising, but I think has risen. It shows that Brazil is capable of projecting culture abroad. Brazil is one of the nations of the world that can export culture, and this is a very important element. The country that can really export culture is this one. Brazil has also that capacity, and I think for some of the same reasons. And so I was very happy reading that. Some of my observations are along the lines of Peter's, and I sort of was looking for a little bit more of a context. The context first from, Brazil is rising where? And the fact that the context is not very much present, and then sometimes you refer to Brazil in relation with the United States. I don't remember if there is a reference, extended reference. I don't think there is an extended reference to the event. That is what happened that made not only Brazil challenge Brazil to face a crisis, and Brazil was able to get out of it very fast, but the crisis in itself, the crisis of September of 2008, is a moment of change where people that affected Brazilians and other people's perceptions about the main country in the system, the United States. It's in relation, the rise is very much in relation to that. You touch upon something that is very much in the debate in Brazil about how some people in Brazil see the relation with the United States sometimes as a zero-sum game. But I think that if you had developed that, you would have put some of your questions, some of your doubts in a better context. Sometimes it looks like, for instance, there is a reference that you make to the fact that the Brazilian military, what they need weapons for, or something that you very rapidly. I think that actually the president that started worrying about that was Fernando Henrique Cardoso after the military. We forgot our military for about 10 years. And if we have to have a military, we better have one that is fully equipped, has a mission, under civilian control. And that's what started under Cardoso. Actually, Cardoso was the president that when some people here in Washington actually started talking about, Brazil needs to buy some airplanes just because the United States needed to sell some airplanes. And he raised the question, what for? Who is the enemy? We are going to protect against what? How are you going to use those airplanes? From that, we developed over the years, and it was President Lula's government that finally came up with a national defense strategy. That's the base. And I think that, sometimes I thought that there was, the information is all there, but the way in some instances you could have presented it, as Peter said, maybe in a more comprehensive way. And sometimes, for instance, the same thing in terms of foreign policy. We have had in Brazil a major debate in the direction of foreign policy. And you use that famous, for those not familiar with that, in 74, I think 74, right? Kissinger? 70, no, 70. So it was Geisel, 70. Silveirinho was for a minute, 76. That Silveira and former minister of Brazil, Azevedo da Silveira, who was later ambassador here, and Henry Kissinger visiting there, visit the Palácio dos Arcos, now Palácio do Itamaraty, the headquarters of the foreign ministry.
Gleaming glass.
It's a very beautiful building, actually, and sort of, make it sort of a joke aside, saying, "Oh, it's a wonderful building. Now you need a foreign policy to go with that." It's look like, and then you mentioned that, it sort of remains valid. I don't think it remains valid. That was a nice joke at the time, but Brazil has a foreign policy. Actually, it started at that time. It started, and I may have been at the moment of creation because I was a correspondent in Portugal, and I remember the day then Foreign Minister Mário Soares, whom I knew very well, coming to me after a rally in front of Palácio de Belém in Lisbon and telling me, "Paulo, Brazil sort of betrayed me." I said, "But why?" Because we had recognized the PAIGC, the independence movement of the Guinea-Bissau, before Lisbon. Until that moment, Everything that Brazil did in Africa went through Lisbon. That was the moment where Brazil really started having its own foreign policy on issues of interest to us. And that is the origin of a foreign policy that has evolved. I see more continuity than discontinuity in Brazilian foreign policy, frankly. And I think it is more robust now, it is more present now. I think, yes, as you pointed out, Brazil has failed in some of its declared objectives in foreign policy, but Brazil is despite that, Brazil is a larger presence in the world today. So, and this is to the credit of this, there is an economic explanation to that. For instance, the South-South strategy that is a subject of debate in Brazil, there is an economic logic to that. It's not so Brazilian businesses, Brazilian construction companies are very much in the south and they are expanding. And I believe, especially in Africa, some people in Brazil are critical of that. I think it's one of the contributions of President Lula to Brazilian foreign policy to open us to Africa. I think it was not only the correct business decision, it was the correct moral decision, because we are, in a sense, we are Africa. We have a debt to Africa that probably no other country other than the United States has. And to me, that's very important to open up. And when you say, for instance, Brazil has not found a way to extricate itself from Haiti, I don't know if we want to or if we should. I think it's something that President Lula was criticized for that by the right, who wanted President Lula to use the army to combat the many situations and the many Haitis we have in Brazil, and by the left, who thought that we were doing the bidding of the United States in Haiti. I think Brazil has learned a lot in this activity. I think that, and I have not seen, it's something actually that the next president will have to decide, because our commitment to Haiti, I think, ends 2011. I believe it's going to be a very tough decision to announce that we're no longer there. I don't expect that to happen. I hope that Brazil is up to the challenge to remain and to continue involved. And this is some part of the new story. Yes, there are controversial decisions. There will be more, and there will be a major challenge. We don't have special leaders like Fernando Henrique Cardoso and like President Lula to lead us. Charismatic people in their own way, but especially Lula. And the foreign policy of Brazil now will have to, in a sense, be carried by the nation, because we don't have that special charismatic person to project us abroad. We are going to have to project ourselves as a nation with our institutions, and this is going to be a major test. But those are my observations, and if you could respond quickly, comment and
Sure.
then we would open up.
Just a general statement about what this book was meant to be and not meant to be. The audience for this, as I said in the beginning, it's not a scholarly or academic book. The objective is that if you're going to be going to Brazil on vacation, if you're curious about this country, that just bought Burger King, how did that happen? If you're thinking of investing, it's a book aimed at that audience. And there are certain things, like I would like to have been able to write more about Getulio Vargas, but it just didn't fit into the format that this was supposed to represent, and the length at which the commercial considerations. Let's see. The two questions you had, Peter, were
How long?
How long? Since this book came out, the Brazilian press has been very interested. I've done a lot of interviews, and there was a serialized pieces of this book in the news magazine Época, and they asked me in the interview accompanying that, in 10 years, are you going to write a book called The Rise and Fall of Brazil? And I said, well, that depends on you guys. There are pitfalls, and I actually wrote down a list. of things that could get in the way, which is why this election next month is important. There's choices that have to be made over the next 4 years. Problems that have to be dealt with. Physical infrastructure. Transportation and communications in particular, they're being strained by the level of, the growth is bumping up against or exceeded the capacity of the physical infrastructure to handle it. I'll be very brief on this. Human resources. Again, there aren't enough technicians, there aren't enough engineers, there aren't enough of any kind of trained, specialized groups in Brazil for the expansion that's foreseen and needed. So that can be a bottleneck. Petrobras, with these enormous discoveries of oil and gas off the coast of Rio and Sao Paulo, I mean, they're talking about needing 250,000 employees, most of whom would be, engineers and technicians. Where are those people going to come from? Then beyond that, there's something I see right now as the Lula era ends. There's a kind of, how shall I put this? A triumphalism, a cockiness, approaching hubris that we have the Midas touch. Everything we touch turns to gold. And there's a tendency to ignore one of the things I've tried to stress, which is the preparatory work, the groundwork that Fernando Henrique did. And number two, to ignore the importance of the world commodities boom, especially the importance of China in this ascent of Brazil. And that creates problems if Dilma wins, because you come into office thinking, we have all the answers. And so they're already saying, well, to develop that oil, we don't really need the foreigners. Let's block that out and make it just a Brazilian operation, but the country doesn't have the capital, the financial capital or the human capital to do that. Another thing, there's a proposal to limit or outlaw the ability of foreigners to buy land in the area south, well, anywhere really, which would put a damper on the economic expansion. So that, let's call it the hubris factor. I'm worried about that. Corruption, still there, and the amount of money sloshing around with this growth that the country has enjoyed means that there's more and more of that, the potential for corruption. So that's an answer to, a kind of an answer to that first question. Now the second part was about Brazil and the world.
What is Brazil? Now it's sitting at the top table.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, I'm speaking here as an American. You know, it's tough. You learn by making mistakes. If you're newly arrived at the table, there's a learning curve. And God knows that we've made so many mistakes in our foreign policy. So I really don't want to be too hard on Brazil. I recognize that a written initiative in May with the Turks to try to resolve the impasse on Iran was disastrous. I mean, I don't think there's any way to get around it. I think that Haiti has, I think Brazil went into Haiti without an exit strategy. I mean, this is kind of the Colin Powell notion of what you should do. You know, you measure your power and you don't go in unless you know how you're going to get out. And again, it's that cocksuredness. You know, we're not the French, we're not the Americans, we're this mestizo mulatto people. It's going to be all brothership and sunshine. And now they're in, and how do you get out? There's an article in Foreign Affairs, the current issue, that Jorge Castañeda wrote. Not Ready for Prime Time is the title of it. There's some things in there I agree with. There's other things I disagree with. Again, this notion of the learning curve. Brazil is going to learn by falling on its face sometimes. And sometimes it's not Brazil's fault. I think on Honduras, and I'm talking about the coup there last year, where the United States and Brazil started out together and ended up in opposing camps. I think both of us got played by Hugo Chavez, who was more adept than either Hillary Clinton or Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. But I view Brazil's increased participation in the international scene as healthy, positive, and of great use to the United States. I've mentioned Hugo Chavez. Let me just pick that as one example. There are people, well, look, I find among Brazilian friends in and out of government an astonishment that the caudillo of a country of 28 million people whose economy is based on one product, oil, should presume to speak as the leader of all of Latin America. There's a Brazilian attitude, hey, that's our role. We're the 8th largest economy in the world. We're 200 million people. That's not their role. And Brazil has defined certain aspects, this is getting to the point you were talking about, of what is our national interest? Well, it's not in Brazil's national interest to have Hugo Chavez speaking on behalf of all of Latin America. So you get Brazil blocking certain gambits, the South Atlantic Treaty Organization that Chavez wanted, the Bank of the South, the pipeline from Caracas to Buenos Aires across Brazilian territory, things like that. And that's Brazil acting in its own national interest as it defines it, but it's also very helpful to American national interest. So I'll let it go at that.
Okay, well, we like to open for questions. Just before we do that, let me recognize Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program. I believe I saw Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue, also around here. Just one piece of information, since or two, latest post, Dilma Rousseff 51, José Serra stationary at 27, Marina Silva stationary at 11. You are not going to be crazy enough to make a prediction, but since I'm not anymore in the daily press business, I will. And the prediction is that Dilma Rousseff will win the presidential election on October 3rd, based on current information on the first round. The only caveat is that President Lula, that knows a little bit more than I do about Brazilian politics, has decided to forgo the chance of appearing last time before the UN General Assembly, and has decided to stay in Brazil because we can get very creative in those last moments before presidential elections in Brazil. We are very talented people. And so the president, knowing that very well, decided to remain in Brazil. And the other important information is that the former Erenice Guerra, who is the person involved in the latest accusations of wrongdoing, the latest scandal, which is
Succeeded Dilma as chief of staff.
Who was Dilma's right-hand person at the Ministry of Energy, who was Dilma's right-hand person at the chief of staff's office and succeeded her, is no longer the chief of staff. She is looking for other sorts of employment because she has resigned today.
Under a cloud.
Under a cloud. The speculation that comes, it's not speculation actually, because this comes not only from us journalists, it's coming from actually people sitting in positions of power, is that this current wave of scandals, and someone that works in a very important position in Brasilia told me, observe that this is all generated inside the government. None of this has been generated from the opposition that ran a rather poor campaign. And so some people interpret this already as the first indications of the political fight coming after October 3rd for positions, in the next arrangement of power. Now, question, Cindy.
Thanks, and thanks, Larry, for being here.
My pleasure.
I haven't had a chance to read the book, so I don't know if it's in here or in the work that you've already done. But I was wondering if you could comment on the role of domestic politics in Brazilian foreign policy, particularly the role of the PT and the kinds of initiatives that Brazil has undertaken vis-a-vis Cuba or Iran or Honduras, and how much that is determined by the sort of the partisan PT kind of ideology, and how much that is likely to be a permanent feature of, Brazil's rise.
Yeah, Brazil in many ways is a lot like other countries, including the U.S., in that foreign policy is really of interest only to an elite, I think. So we're not talking about an average voter in Pernambuco or even in Rio. We're talking about an issue that's of interest, to university professors and businessmen, but not the man on the street. And I would say that there is an element. I mean, one has to distinguish in Brazilian foreign policy between the element that is national and the element that is the Workers' Party. And there's been a ratcheting up of certain elements that have always been part of the Workers' Party arsenal of rhetoric. And it's my opinion, it's conventional wisdom, and I share this, that Lula, because he really kind of betrayed the left of his party on economics and didn't have the rupture that they have been dreaming of for years and years, to satisfy them, he's kind of talked a tougher game on foreign policy. So to that extent, yes, it's, domestic politics does play a role. And to go back to the Jorge Castaneda piece, I said there were things I agreed with and things I didn't agree with. I haven't written an email to Jorge yet, but I will. And one of the things I want to say is that I think that he needs to make a clearer distinction between the fact that the PT has its own foreign policy. The Workers' Party has a foreign policy. Marco Aurelio Garcia, who has been Lula's tutor on foreign affairs, just in the same way that Condoleezza Rice was George Bush's tutor, he has a worldview that clashes, frankly, with Itamaraty, with the foreign ministry. And there's been this dance going on, especially in Lula's first term, where Marco Aurelio will say one thing, and then 2 days later, Celso Amorim, the foreign minister, has to walk it back. It's a tension that's there. I don't know what's going to happen with Dilma. Dilma doesn't have foreign policy experience really to speak of, and I don't know where she stands on a lot of things. It's going to be interesting. I'm going to be watching closely to see who her foreign minister would be. There's talk of Antonio Patriota, who a lot of folks here would obviously know from him being ambassador. There's other names too, but he's the name I hear as the current front runner. Because of those factors, because of the inexperience factor, I don't know that Brazil is going to be as energetic about pursuing, for example, the permanent seat in the Security Council at the UN. I've had Brazilian former foreign ministers say to me, we always talked that game, but we never went after it because you antagonize the Mexicans and the Argentines, and you're not going to get the seat, so why do it? I would think that maybe Dilma would dial back a bit on that.
Alec?
Thank you. I love talking about that.
Put it into a political context. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, whom we've been talking about very positively here, is now not viewed very positively in Brazil anymore. So there's been a shift of attitude. And Lula is almost reified at this point. So the question I have is, when Dilma is elected, what do you think the expectations, the popular expectations of her will be coming out of this cultural process? And I was interested in your touching on the word hubris at some point, whether there are going to be expectations that she has no chance of meeting and that quite quickly she could start to disappoint, or do you think that if she can just keep the Lula economy going, she'll be in pretty good shape.
Well, I mean, part of the answer to that question is, assuming that she wins, what is Lula going to be doing for the next 4 years? Where is he going to be? I can't see him really going off to a quiet retirement sitting on the veranda of his apartment in São Bernardo do Campo. You know, Brazilian law, the Constitution would allow him, if he so desires, to be a candidate for president again in the next, in 2014. So to what extent is he going to want to continue to give that blessing to her? To what extent is he going to want to pull the strings over the next 4 years? Is he going to want to, does he expect that she's going to step aside in 4 years so that he can run? You know, all of this is kind of questions that everybody's going to be looking at after January 1st. And as regards Fernando Henrique, well, yeah, I mean, you know, I think he's not getting the credit that is due him. When he left, he was voted in a poll the best president in Brazilian history, better even than Getulio Vargas or Juscelino, who had been the kind of shining stars since then. Over the last 8 years, you know, the Workers' Party has done a pretty good job of selling the population on the notion, we did it, we did it. That we received, you know, they talk about herança maldita, a cursed inheritance. Well, it wasn't that at all, but they've done a good job of selling it.
That happened in another country later on, but
Paulo,
don't
Paulo,
mention it.
Paulo, can I just
Yes.
say, you know, I think Lula will continue to play a role in Brazilian politics, very popular. One has to remember that when one leaves the presidency, no matter how popular, there is a new president. Dilma is going to be on the front page of the newspaper every day. I think of Ricardo Lagos in Chile, who was tremendously popular when he left office, the most popular president ever. Very shortly, his successor, Michelle Bachelet, sort of took over, and really he began to be badly criticized and decided, in fact, not to run again in the next election because he had lost so much ground. And my suspicion is that Brazil is not going to sort of just be linked to the Lula motor. And I remember even that the first year and a half of the Lula government, one saw his numbers in the polls declining until almost a year later, when the economy began a slow pickup. And it was the pickup of the economy. And in fact, if you trace his numbers over time, the economy is the big driver of that. And so I suspect that that will happen with Dilma as well. Less Lula and more the economy playing the role.
Yeah, I agree, but there's 2 points I would make on that. Number one is that the Workers' Party, Lula is more popular than the Workers' Party. They need him badly, and he knows that and gives him leverage that, like, Ricardo Lagos didn't have. And the thing is that Lula has this 30-year trajectory within the Workers' Party. Dilma's only been in the party for 9 years. There are guys, as Paulo pointed out, in the jockeying that's going on now for cabinet seats, even before the election. There, you can see at least 2 factions elbowing each other aside. And Lula, I think, is going to have to referee some of that, because I don't know that Dilma has the track record in the party. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, it's going to be fascinating to watch this play out over the next few years. But, yeah, Lula's Lula.
Thank you. Larry, you've made a good case for change in Brazil, and I just want to ask you about something that may not have changed so much, or I'm wondering how much it's changed. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Mary Speck, a visiting fellow, and many years ago a colleague of Larry's. And that is the whole issue of inequality in Brazil. Many years ago, we used to refer to the Sao Paulo region as Belgium and India, and that was when India was a symbol of unremitting and horrible poverty. Of course, India means something else. But on both the societal, class level, within cities and within regions, I mean, Brazil was, and I believe still is, one of the most unequal countries in the world. And certainly that's a problem throughout Latin America, but it's always been particularly acute in Brazil. And I'm just wondering, is that really changed a lot? Or is that a political and social economic issue that's come back to haunt future presidents?
These past 16 years, I think it's gotten better, but there's still great inequality based on race, based on money. Social inequality is a major problem, but it's nothing like it used to be. And I think that the next government is dedicated to focusing a lot of energy on, dealing with it. So,
John?
John Maister, retired U.S. diplomat. Larry, I haven't read the book, but I'm intrigued by the cultural piece that I've heard explored here. And it seems to me there's a political cultural piece. Since the mid-90s, I have been watching from Venezuela and then from Washington and from various jobs how Brazil, writ large, gets its way in the Western Hemisphere. And it's not just the government.
yeah.
It's not just the government. It's not just Itamaraty, as clever as Itamaraty is. It's the private sector. It's the intellectuals. It's the media. This is really, Brazil has risen, at least with regard to the hemisphere, but much larger than that. How does the cultural part fit into it from your vantage point? I'm intrigued by this, and as an American, I just, there are lots of things that we have to think about when we think about this.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because this is actually the reason why I have a whole chapter on the jeito, because it's really the way Brazilians deal with each other. There's all these phrases like, having your game. The society works in a way that you're looking for accommodations, you're looking for creative solutions, you're trying to maneuver, and that doesn't always work in a setting outside the Brazilian borders, but there are techniques that can be applied, and they have been. I recount in here, I went to high school with Charlene Barshevsky, so we've known each other since we were 13, and when she was USTR, I would talk to her, and she would say, man, these guys are good. But good in a way where it's not an adversarial negotiation. They want to defend their national interest. They recognize that you have interests too, and hey, let's find a way to make it happen. And if we have to be creative, okay, we'll do that.
So we'll start here with Norman, then go across to 300, then I come back.
Thank you, Norman Bailey, Institute of World Politics. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for your comments today. Monday and Tuesday of this week, I spent all day, Monday and Tuesday, lecturing to a group of U.S. government officials on Brazilian economics, politics, and U.S.-Brazilian relations. And I told them all to buy your book, so you owe me a commission. And in any case, your list of bad things that might happen to the Brazilian economy started out with physical infrastructure, which is clearly inadequate. My question is this, because it's a great mystery to me. I don't know a single commentator on the Brazilian economy who has not mentioned this as being a very important issue. Both Brazilians and non-Brazilian commentators, economists, and so on and so forth. Brazil obviously has the capacity. It has some of the best engineering and construction companies in the world. It has the financial resources. Why is this not taken care of?
Yes, can I get some questions?
Sure,
and then
sure.
Let's go across the table.
Xenia Wilkinson. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer who served in Brazil, and I have not read your book yet, but you've made me want to read it. I have been looking at Brazil in an academic way recently, and I'm struck by the boom and bust cycles of Brazil. I notice a heavy preponderance of primary agricultural products and natural resources as bases for the current boom, as well as jets and a few other things. But my question is, do you think that Brazil has now overcome the boom and bust cycle and has a solid, diversified economic base to sustain the current prosperity?
Those two, and then we can.
Okay. Well, the first chapter of the book is called The History of Booms and Busts. So I'm very much aware of that. I think that what Brazil has done over the past 40 years, let's say, has been to diversify so that you avoid these cycles where you get focused on one product, rubber, sugar, coffee, whatever it was, so that you have multiple agricultural products, you have multiple industrial products, so that rises and falls in one, a fall in one is compensated for by a rise in another. So how it's managed is another question, but the groundwork has been done so that you don't have to necessarily see this end badly, that this boom ends in a bust. Now, on the infrastructure question, I mean, I don't know what to tell you, to be perfectly honest, because, right, everybody knows this. There's been investment, but it's slow and it's not enough. And Paulo and I have talked about this. I think we both agree that the next president, whoever he or she is going to really have to focus on this and will focus, because otherwise you're going to hit a wall. And we're talking roads, we're talking ports, we're talking river transport, electricity, communications, just about everything you can mention in the way of physical infrastructure.
And it has to do with the low savings rates of the country. Yes, Peter, and then here, and then Andrew.
Yeah,
1, 2, 3.
Peter Whitney. I teach economics at 2 different universities. What is your view on the Bolsa Familiar? It certainly, at the beginning, seemed to help with some of the inequality issue, or at least bring people into feeling that they were included, and may have been tied to some incentives to put the kids in school. I don't know all the details, but those were the general outlines. How is it working long run? Are the people dependent on it and just more? Is it having a net and future impact?
Can you pass the mic to Andrew Rudman? Here, next.
Hey, do you want me to, Andrew Rudman with Pharma. I had a question that I think sort of ties into the challenges and the future and kind of where Brazil wants to go internationally, which relates to the sort of import substitution industrialization policies that to some extent it seems they're moving in some ways more toward, and in a sense perhaps that under Dilma they'd go even more in that direction of trying to have the state identify winners and losers in sectors, which obviously has the potential to make it more difficult for U.S. and other foreign companies to successfully operate in Brazil. And there's, I think, a dichotomy potentially or juxtaposition between Brazil's increasing globalization of its own economy and its own firms, and where you run into potentially a bit of a conflict in, Brazilian firms wanting to be active worldwide, and yet worldwide firms being in some ways limited in their ability to interact in Brazil. And I don't know if you had any thoughts on where that might go, or whether that's an issue that the Brazilian business community would engage more actively in with the government.
Let's get a third question. Just keep moving the microphone down the line.
This was a perfect segue to my question. So almost to the point where I don't need to ask it, but I'll do it anyway. I kept putting it over here. On the topic of state capitalism, defined both through the very hands-on industrial policy that you were talking about, but also the role of state-owned enterprises in the competitive environment, how do you see that contributing to the rise of Brazil, and how do you see that going into the future? And does that present a growth opportunity to the Brazilian economy, or does it present a pitfall?
Okay, let me take those two questions as one then, and talk about them before I go to the Bolsa Familia. Let me make a declaration here of my own leanings. I'm not one of these people who believes that the market is magical and resolves everything. And I think when you look at Brazil's recent history, there are some examples in which you've had successes that could not have occurred without a role for the state. I mentioned Embraer, founded in 1969. It was privatized in 1993, 4, I forget which year. It took years and years of the state supporting that to put it into a position where it could become viable, and then it's privatized, and then they zero in on the niche, the commuter jets. The alcohol program, again, the state's hand is there. It guided it to a point where then market forces could take over, but the market by itself would never have had the patience to endure, 25 years of losses at Embraer, or 30 years of investments in the alcohol program. So, when I talk to other Latin Americans, the thing they're envious about is that Brazil has a national strategy, that there is an industrial policy, there is an industrial strategy, or a larger economic strategy, which also includes, agriculture. And it has served Brazil well. As regards what happens under Dilma, I've read some things she's written, and she does sound like she maybe wants to not go back to a classic import substitution model, but there are some elements of it that appeal to her. But as you point out, Brazil is inserted into this larger world entity and is a player on that level. And does it have the luxury of doing that? I don't know. I count always on Brazilian pragmatism to win out in the end, and I think that's what will prevail. And then finally, on Bolsa Familia, again, this is something that has relevance for us here in the United States because, income redistribution, which was a hot-button issue in the 2008 campaign. You're really seeing that here. And again, the model for that goes back to the Fernando Henrique Cardoso years. It actually goes to, I think, Cristóvão Buarque, when he was governor of the...
and before that to Mexico, and before that to Unicamp.
Right. It's got a long history, and it gets tweaked as it goes along. The concerns that it becomes an instrument by which the party gathers favors and debts and hands out favors, I think can be well-founded. I've traveled in parts of the Northeast where I thought I saw that was happening, and I like the idea of there being a quid pro quo. I think there has to be a quid pro quo for it to really be effective and functioning.
Let me ask a question from the overflow room. I think it's from Tom O'Keefe, this question. Given the inability of the Obama administration to provide any type of leadership on the recently launched Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, do you see Brazil taking a more practical, more proactive approach?
Short answer, no. The longer answer is that Brazilian energy policy is in flux right now. The thing I noticed when I was last there late last year was that the rhetoric was starting to change. Before it was ethanol is going to be the miracle that makes Brazil an energy power. But now that Brazil thinks it has this oil and gas bonanza, the rhetoric is starting to get a little more OPECian, if such a word exists.
OPECian? That's a good word.
Yeah, okay. And so, yes, ethanol is still important, but I worry that the oil and gas thing becomes so dazzling that Brazil focuses too much on that and tends to put the other stuff aside.
Talking about ethanol, Joel, do you have a question? He represents UNICA, the Brazilian Ethanol Trade Association.
I'm not going to touch that one. But Larry, I've read your book. I've given it away, so now I got to buy another one. So I get a double commission, I guess. I think President Lula is probably one of the at least first president, and one of the probably big distinctions, Alec, I think from Cardoso, they really wasn't shy about talking about Brazil's ambition, especially as it projected abroad. Where do you see Dilma in that sense? I mean, is she going to want to talk about what is her ambition for Brazil, and is she going to be able to project that in a way that, outside of a PowerPoint, that I know she can do on ambition?
She has so little of a track record on foreign affairs that it's really hard to say. I don't know whether.
But beyond just abroad, even internally, where do you want to put Brazil in the next 5 years?
There's a number of questions I have to ask. Who's in charge? Who's foreign minister? Who's her national security advisor? Because if Marco Aurelio Garcia continues, then you have to think it's going to go in one direction. If somebody else is foreign minister, it's in another. I'm not sure she feels comfortable. Maybe she's going to delegate that. I wonder. I fear that at this date, I don't have the information I need to even hazard a guess. There's too many unknowns, I think.
It's all about your second book.
Since he moved to the cultural section, he stopped speculating. It's amazing.
This is Ajay Shankar from India, scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. You'd mentioned that you see manpower shortages acting as a bit of a constraint. So I was just curious, is the attitude in the elite towards immigration, and is that debated, discussed the way it is in the U.S., or it's a non-political issue?
Well, Brazil is a country of immigrants. It's one of the things that it shares in common with the United States, and a lot of the immigrants came from the same places. Italy, Germany, Poland, plus Portugal, Spain, and Japan, which is, even larger Japanese immigration there than here. That said, modern Brazil has not really been a nation of immigrants, although, let me qualify that. There is this illegal immigration that comes from especially Bolivia and Paraguay, and if you go into a textile factory or a shoe factory, for example, in the Braz neighborhood of Sao Paulo, you're going to find that factory is probably run by a Korean, and that most of the employees are either from Paraguay or Bolivia. But that's under the table. Above the table, much less.
Just information on, and I hear this from Brazilian diplomats currently, I think, in Argentina. About 100,000 Bolivians have entered Brazil in the last few years. 80,000 of those have had their situation legalized. So the approach is, I think, quite interesting. Latest figure on foreign workers in Brazil, there is in statistics just recently, I think last year we imported 21,000. Obviously a lot of those are people working in the oil platforms, but there are indications of, because of the shortage, because some companies need desperately some types of skills that we don't have. So you are starting to see that, and that is in itself a major challenge for Brazil, because it exposes the problem of a education system that is not producing what it should. Continuing with questions, I think there's questions over there. Yes? 2, 3, yes?
Yes, I'd like to thank you for writing this book about my country. I'm Brazilian. I'm a student of political science here in the U.S. And the question I have is going to shift a little bit from Brazil and goes towards the U.S. because the U.S., has interests in the region that make conflict, with interests, Brazilian interests. And how much of a part do you think, U.S. policy towards the region may impact, the rise of Brazil, either keeping Brazil on the rise or preventing Brazil from rising?
On that one, I will invite Peter to say something, because Peter, in this very institution, said recently that actually we should stop thinking about Brazil and U.S. interests as convergent, because maybe they are not. So now you're going to have to explain yourself.
Larry first, and then I comment. I always am better.
Yes.
No, I mean, there are areas of convergence and areas of difference, and you know, we have to be honest about what they are, and sort them out. I think, you know, it's funny because the shift from Bush to Obama has been disappointing to Brazilians, I would say, because they expected more. And guess what? The President of the United States defends American interests. You know, he's not palsy-walsy all the time. So, yeah, there's going to be tensions. I mean, look, Brazil and the United States interact more than they did in the past, and obviously that means there are going to be more frictions. But I think that overall the relationship is cordial. I use that's kind of a cliche, but you know, there's goodwill on both sides. Sometimes I see both sides getting exasperated with each other, and oftentimes I get calls from both sides saying, "What do they mean by this?" And it's fun to be, you know, that kind of a cultural interpreter. But the relationship is not antagonistic, and I don't think it will become so. But that's kind of different from saying
somewhat of a different view. I think that the relationship has become antagonistic, you know, and
overall or on particular points.
Well, particularly Iran, but Iran plays such a large role. If you look at the various places that Brazil and the United States intersect on policy, there's a whole economy that really has gone to the highest levels of the administration. You heard Hillary Clinton talk about it. You heard Barack Obama talk about it. And that is shaping the way the U.S. is thinking of Brazil, that on an issue of central importance to the United States. This is one of the three biggest foreign policy issues the U.S. is now, that, you know, Brazil ought to be more helpful. And they should certainly, if not being helpful, they ought to stay out of the picture, but not come into the picture in a way that seems to be lining up within an adversary of the U.S. And my sense, frankly, is that Brazil has reached a point that the U.S. and Brazil are going to be bumping against each other internationally over a lot of different issues in the coming years, that there are not parallel interests there. There may be some. If I had to guess the next one, I would think it on the whole issue of non-proliferation and Brazil's nuclear program.
I was just about to say
that's going to become a very serious area of conflict.
Right.
To elaborate on that.
Actually, I get into that in the book here. And on that point, I do agree with you, because I don't think that Brazil has definitively interred all of its nuclear ambitions. I mean, there's not going to be a bomb. There's not going to be a Brazilian bomb. But a Brazilian nuclear submarine, and the principle of, you know, Lula in particular has made statements about the rights of states to pursue the nuclear cycle. Yeah, that's definitely an area of disagreement, and I think is likely to become even more so as the Brazilian military, looking for this mission that it wants to have. I mean, you know, that national defense strategy that Paulo mentioned, it talks about having a nuclear submarine to defend the offshore platforms. I mean, that's goofy.
I don't understand much about submarines or platforms, but I think that this is a debate that we will have to have in Brazil, and I agree with you. Now, in 1988, we adopted a clause in our constitution renouncing the bomb, and we did that basically because the military regime was producing a weapon or trying to produce in a secret program. So as a reaction, not only we adopted that clause, we said that's unamendable. So we will never go back there unless we change the constitution. Then in 97, and there was not much debate. In 97, without much debate, we entered the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that obviously is an unequal treaty. It's a treaty that recognizes special rights to a group of countries and tell the others bye, which has been further undermined by the Bush administration agreement with India later on, which made actually President Cardozo look pretty bad, that previous decision. And more recently, without much debate, we announced that we will never sign the additional protocol of the NPT. So I don't think at some point we are going to get together and we'll just say, guys, let's have a policy here, because those parts don't go together very well.
Can I just add one little? The problem is that no one now thinks Brazil is aiming for the bomb, and it's not aiming for an atomic weapon now. The problem is that you don't aim for an atomic weapon. You aim to build the capacity first to enrich uranium, and then to enrich it to a higher level. And in other words, there is not an on and off switch. This is a gradual process, and almost everybody that I talk to in Brazil seems to agree Brazil should have the capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you have the capacity, it's different making the decision then when you're just starting down that path. And so I just think that there's going to be huge disagreements on this whole issue, not necessarily because Brazil is going to end up with a weapon or not, but just along the way, that there is a whole management of nuclear proliferation globally that has to be set in motion. And Brazil and the U.S. disagree on how that should work.
No question. And the Brazilian Navy, frankly, is a problem, because they don't want inspectors in that plant in Resende, which is, west of Rio. And, they've had these go-rounds with the IAEA where you get kind of a jeito to resolve that. But how long can that last? At some point, I think push is going to have to come to shove. The nuclear submarine thing may be the issue that galvanizes
No,
that.
but so far Brazil is in full compliance with its obligations. So it's not, there was a question, it was the headline of the Washington Post on the first Sunday when Abdenur came as ambassador, arrived as ambassador, and he almost had a heart attack because it was pretty ill-timed for him. Let me go around. You have a question, right? And there, then, yes, quick, we are almost running out of time, so be brief, please. Others
too. Charlton, freelance correspondent. You mentioned that it's the end of the rural era, and then could you talk about the urbanization process and what's its impact? And are there any political debate on climate change in Brazil? Thank you.
Right.
Okay. Urbanization. I mean, Brazil's gone from 1940, 80% of the population lived in the countryside, 20% in the cities. It's now reversed. So there's been a tremendous process of urbanization, and one outgrowth of that is, of course, the favelas, the squatter slums on the outskirts of Brazilian cities. That's become a huge social problem. Climate change. This is something that I've complained about a lot and gotten into arguments with people in Brazil, because Brazil at international climate change conferences was often as obstructionist as the Bush administration was, and sometimes won that Fossil of the Day award. However, I've got to say that I was happy to see in Copenhagen that there was some give on the Brazilian position last December, and that there was this, let's admit that it's completely imperfect, and it's just the 5 countries that came to a side deal, and it didn't pass through the overall conference. But it was the first time I saw Brazil make a commitment to reduction of greenhouse gases. It's not binding, I admit that too, but Brazil's position had always been, before that, nobody's going to tell us it's the problem of the industrial countries. They deal with it. We and the Chinese are not responsible. We want to be able to do what we want to do, and now that position has shifted slightly.
Okay, thank you. 2 more gentlemen here, and then.
Winston Wilkinson from Johns Hopkins. How will the expansion of Brazil's private sector companies like Vale and Ambev that are expanding abroad through acquisitions, and that's up to the point where 2 weeks ago you had the announcement that several Brazilians, or at least a Brazilian group, announced the take private of Burger King. How will the expansion of these companies impact Brazil's foreign policy and Brazil's rise?
Wow, I got to confess, that's a question I haven't really thought about a lot. So let me just think out loud and take it as that. I think that a lot of the companies are still kind of feeling their way. They've traditionally focused on the domestic market, and they're trying to get their sea legs in the international realm. I don't know that they themselves have foreign policies, or they look to the government maybe to open markets, and through the National Development Bank create conditions where they can export and invest. An exception might be the construction companies, which, going back to Iraq under Saddam Hussein, were active in doing things that could get them in trouble. That's not the case. I don't want to say that's the case today. I think that the São Paulo, the Fiesp, the Industrial Federation of the State of São Paulo, has some very capable people thinking about these issues, but I don't know that I would say the same is true, let's say, in Pernambuco or Ceará. So it's still intermittent and tentative.
But there is something, I don't know if you would agree, or Peter, there is something interesting about that, because it undermines some of the arguments of the left and the right in Brazil about the foreign involvement. Okay, because it's Brazilians that are Anheuser-Busch, or whatever the name is, that InBev, is managed by a Brazilian. So if you have any complaints about Budweiser, talk to us now, because it's not the problem. But I think there is a level of engagement that reflects back in Brazil, and I think it's very positive. It makes Brazil more of a global. And the kids in Brazil, young people in Brazil, get this very quickly. This is why international relations has become the most popular university course in Brazil. People see opportunities for work, to engage abroad. So there is something there. But in those changes will have to be internalized. Some of that will have to be internalized in Brazil. I think there's a last question here. Yes.
Yes, Sergio de la Peña from L3 Communications. Could you address the issue of security, especially in light of the upcoming World Games or the World Cup, the Olympics, and then given that oftentimes that becomes a forcing function, especially in the big cities, and then how the drug trafficking and drug violence relates to that challenge?
Yeah, it's funny because I was just thinking, here's the last question, and it hasn't been a question about security, and how interesting that is.
We organize everything very well.
Okay.
Believe us.
Look, Brazil is going to have two major world events, the World Cup in 2014, the Olympics in Rio in 2016.
And the Miss America contest.
And the International Military Games, there is such thing, actually, in Rio also. I think that one is going to be pretty secure.
But, here's the thing. Brazil sees this as the affirmation of its emergence on the world scene as a power, in much the same way that Tokyo functioned for Japan in 1964, and Seoul for Korea in 1988, and Beijing for China in 2008.
What about Mexico, 68?
68 got messed up. Maybe that's what the intention was, but it sure got messed up. And that's the danger. The Tlatelolco incident, the slaughter of the students, cast a pall over Mexico's image, and Brazil has to be careful. This is a tremendous opportunity for the country, but it could go wrong, and because of the security issue. And because Rio is the focus of that, and that's the city I know best, the drug gangs, they have money, they have guns, they often have more weaponry than the police. How are you going to deal with that? It's a real mess. When I first went to Brazil, the favelas were mostly in the hands of guys who ran the Brazilian numbers game. Now it's the drug lords, and their guys are in prison with cell phones running their operations. When I was living in my office was in Ipanema, an order would come that the stores have to shut down, and you better do it or they'll firebomb you. Grenades and mortars were fired at the city hall. Last month, a bunch of guys from Rocinha, one of the biggest favelas, came down, took hostages in the Hotel Intercon. They got to deal with this, because if they don't, it's going to sully Brazil's image, and this tremendous opportunity is going to be lost. And not only for the sake of foreigners am I saying this. I'm saying it mostly for the sake of the Cariocas and the Paulistas and the people who live in Recife. Because, living in Rio, I knew that after certain hours of the day, I shouldn't go to this neighborhood or that. And it puts a crimp on, you're worried, you're fearful. My wife would go visit, her relatives in certain neighborhoods, and she'd have to pass through other ones.
Can I ask a question, Larry?
Sure.
That I just came back from Mexico, and the violence there is front page news every day.
Yeah.
It's what people talk about. It's everything. Good news is even bad news because of it. And I was in Brazil 2 weeks before that, and nobody talks about violence and crime almost, at least very limited. And it certainly doesn't look like it threatens the governance of the country. It's not threatening and yet crime rates, or homicide rates at least, are twice in Brazil what they are in Mexico. Now, how has Brazil avoided sort of this becoming a central
Because
issue?
it does not affect the governance of the country.
Why?
It affects
Why?
the governance of certain areas.
Well, that's the
on
same
the-
thing in Mexico, though.
But
I mean, I don't quite understand that.
better statistics.
What? The Brazilian.
More transparency on the statistics.
Maybe.
Which country?
Brazil, yeah. And there have been responses. Actually, we have featured some of them here. There have been some strategies in cities in Brazil. There is one now going on in Rio that is very creative. The pacifying police units where they move, they specially trained. Actually, City of God, that was the theme of that very difficult film to watch, is now levels of violence in City of God are down substantially, and it's a tough problem. But I don't think that, Peter, that people are just ignoring that, etc. I think people, maybe it's in the news.
Oh,
It is
no
a concern,
question.
and
I'm
among
just saying
Brazilians,
it's not
actually.
sort of a central sort of, it's not determining the course
It's not
of
the only
election.
news.
It's not determining.
Maybe because in Mexico it's almost the prevalent issue, and in Brazil it is a big issue, but it's not the only one. So, sir.
And one last thing, one last point I'd want to make about this: the police are part of the problem. It's not, good guys and bad guys. The police are often violent, shoot first, ask questions later. They're corrupt, they're inefficient, and you get this population. I mean, my wife used to work in a favela called Borel, and the people who live there, they feel like they're caught between, it's almost like, two warring armies, and they want social stability, they want peace. They don't view the police as being able to bring it, which is why the initiative that Paulo is talking about is important, because it maybe creates a way where you can restore confidence in the police, which is part of the problem.
And just in a little bit more than 3 months, we will hold all of those problems, all those possibilities. We'll have all of them together, and we'll ask probably a woman to take care of them for us. And actually, this is one aspect that I think we should highlight, the fact that if you think in a positive way, and even when I was a journalist, I used to think in a positive way, which is amazing. But I think that after having the first man of the people as president, to have the first woman as president, as the current post suggests, is very positive thing. Is challenging to her, to Brazil. I would like to thank Peter for partnering with us on this event, and I would like particularly to thank my dear friend Larry Roter. I know that he is going to continue to write on culture and things, but from time to time he will always go back to Brazil, writing about Brazil. It's in his blood now. And I thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here, and I thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
Little notes, on the 22nd we have an event about public attitudes in Brazil about the rest of the world, how we see the rest of the world. And we'll be a little bit about the campaign, etc. And then on the 23rd, we will have a discussion on, again, partnering with the dialogue with SEBRI and with Prospectiva, a very good discussion, I believe, on Brazil-U.S. relations, and that will feature, among others, Ambassador Tom Shannon, that will participate. So come, the price is the same, and the coffee will be better.